Hi, Technically Human listeners. I'm on vacation this week, and our team has pulled one of our favorite interviews and definitely, hands down, our funniest from our archive to share with you. An episode with Dan Lyons on what makes Silicon Valley funny and how that humor gets at some of the deeply sobering realities of Silicon Valley culture. If you haven't had a chance to listen to the interview yet, I think you'll enjoy it. I'll be back next week with a brand new episode of the show. This is Deb Donig with Technically Human, a podcast about ethics and technology, where I ask what it means to be human in the age of tech. Each week, I interview industry leaders, thinkers, writers, and technologists, and I ask them about how they understand the relationship between humans and the technologies we create. We discuss how we can build a better vision for technology, one that represents the best of our human values. And we are back with a brand new season of Technically Human. To kick off the season, I am absolutely thrilled to bring you an interview with the incredible Dan Lyons. I am not going to skimp on this introduction because Dan Lyons is one of the most important thinkers influencing our understanding of Silicon Valley culture. He blends brilliance, insight, and humor, traits that led him to write and co-produce one of the most iconic shows about tech of our times, HBO's Silicon Valley. Dan Lyons is one of the best-known science and technology journalists in the United States. He was the technology editor at Newsweek, a staff writer at Forbes, and a columnist for Fortune magazine, while also contributing op-ed columns to the New York Times about the economics and culture of Silicon Valley. As the technology editor of Newsweek, he broadened the scope of the magazine's tech coverage to include energy policy, artificial intelligence, supercomputing, fusion energy, robotics, autonomous vehicles, nation-state hacking, and cyber defense. Dan is the author of two of the most important recent books about Silicon Valley: Disrupted, My Adventures in the Startup Bubble, which became an international bestseller, and Lab Rats, How Silicon Valley Made Work Miserable for the Rest of Us, which was chosen by The Guardian as one of the best business books of 2018 and earned a glowing review in The Economist for its forward-thinking analysis connecting tech-driven globalization, hypercapitalism in Silicon Valley, and widening income inequality, as well as a prescription for rebuilding capitalism for the 21st century. His books have been translated into more than a dozen languages. He is also the mastermind of the genius parody blog, The Fake Steve Jobs blog. If you haven't read it yet, check it out. I promise you, you will not regret any of the dozens, maybe hundreds of hours you will spend there. Over the past decade, Dan has given countless keynote addresses about technology and the modern workplace, including 2 lectures at the Royal Society for the Arts, or RSA, in London, a venue that attracts policymakers, investors, and thought leaders. Among thought leaders in tech, he is considered the expert on the culture of work and how it's changing businesses and lives. Dan has earned a reputation as a fearless critic of powerful interests in Silicon Valley, with a voice that sets him apart from the often fawning journalism that comes out of the technology space. He has been a vocal critic of racial, gender, and age bias in the technology industry, penning articles about bro culture, worker exploitation, and the hustle mentality that leads to employee burnout. He has become a leading advocate for greater diversity in the technology industry and an early critic of the gig economy for its abuse of workers. His work helped draw attention to the brutal working conditions in Amazon warehouses. Dan is a true visionary, a pioneer, a leader, and he's blisteringly funny. He's also a personal hero of mine. I hope you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed making it. And now, here's Dan. Hi, Dan.
Hi.
So, Dan, to prepare for this interview, I rewatched all 6 seasons of Silicon Valley. I watched White Hat, Black Hat twice just to make sure that I got it. Then I read your blog, The Secret Diary of Steve Jobs, in which you write in the character of fake Steve Jobs. It was probably the most fun I have ever had preparing for a podcast interview. You might be the first official funny person that I've had on the podcast series, which is about tech, ethics, and the humanities. Real funny business, right? So I wanted to ask you, what does humor show us about the world of tech that we wouldn't otherwise maybe see or know or understand?
That's a great question. And it's something I've thought about a lot. Like when I was writing Fake Steve, it occurred to me that there were things I could cover and things I could say in that character that maybe I would never have said in my day job as a straight journalist at Forbes at the time, which was pretty uptight, which is also why I created the character, because all this stuff would happen when you were covering technology. And then, most of us all knew each other, the reporters covering it. And, we would talk about stuff and gossip and about this person and that, and this CEO is like that. But, it never could come through in what we were writing. So it was a way to kind of delve, beneath the surface and to look at it or to show things that as a regular journalist, you couldn't show. And I think making fun of things, making something funny is a way of holding it up and looking at it from a different angle. So, I think it sounds overly grandiose to say all this stuff about comedy because you're really just trying to make people laugh. But, I think people looked at the show, Silicon Valley, and often people would say, oh, it's too close to home. Oh, it's so true. But it also made people see the tech industry in a new way.
I'm so curious about this. I live in Silicon Valley. So I'm curious, from your perspective, what makes Silicon Valley funny? The place, not the show. I know what makes the show funny. That's good writing. What makes a place, Silicon Valley, funny?
Well, you live there, right? So but the one thing we always used to key in on in the writer's room on that show is that everybody is so earnest and they all will talk about making the world a better place. And really, they're just hustlers. They're all just trying to make a buck. Ironically, I think the people in the previous generation of Silicon Valley were maybe more idealistic and actually did change the world more, but they didn't talk about it in that way. So, it's all this sort of sanctimonious stuff. And, you have these people who make a lot of money, say become a billionaire doing one thing. And, maybe it's skill, maybe some of it's luck, but then they come to believe that they're experts at everything. And, that's hilarious, right? That's just really, really funny. People like Reid Hoffman calling himself a public intellectual. It's like, well, if you're a public intellectual, you don't call yourself a public intellectual, that's hilarious. And, we're laughing at you. We're not laughing with you, so I don't know. I think there's just so many preposterous people there, especially in the last 10, 20 years in the internet era.
Well, this is actually something that I've been thinking a lot about. Very recently, of course, we just had Elon Musk appear on SNL. I'm not sure that I missed much when I didn't watch that, but I'm not sure that I would have found him funny. I do wonder about the current tendency in Silicon Valley, but also in the broader context of the United States, to worship people or to think that they have some sort of intellectual prowess because they've made a lot of money in one thing. And then we treat them as though they have wisdom and skill and dexterity and everything else. Why would somebody assume that Elon Musk, a Barnum and Bailey kind of like tech investor, would be a good host of a comedy show? Or why would we assume that Donald Trump, a reality star and a questionable real estate person, would be a good president of the country? Or why would we assume that Mark Zuckerberg would be an authority on public schools? I guess the question here that I have, picking up on what you just said, is about the gap between success and wisdom and how that works in Silicon Valley and what the consequences are of this kind of thinking or assumption.
Wow, that is a really deep question, right? I try to remember most of what you said and then answer it. But for what it's worth, I did watch the SNL with Elon Musk. And for what it's worth, I really can't stand him. I think he's super annoying. And I hate watched it. I was just wanting him to crash and burn and be awful. And much to my chagrin, he was actually pretty good. I mean, especially for, the non-actor kind of host. They're usually terrible, but he did a smart thing. He played a nerdy weirdo guy in every skit he was in. And it sort of worked. I mean, he's not, he had no timing. He's not a comedian, but, and you could tell they kind of wrote skits for him. And they also put him off at the edge of the skit so everybody else could carry him. Yeah, but he wasn't bad. And, I do think it's crazy. For example, he thought he was an expert on the coronavirus. And, really, he just didn't want to shut down his factory because he didn't want to lose money, So that's the kind of thing I think is really hilarious, too, is when, Elon thinks he's an expert on that. Or, like you say, Mark Zuckerberg is an expert on education. For some reason, they all latch on to education. They all think they can fix education. They all love to say that, education hasn't changed in 100 years and blah, blah, blah. They sort of have vague ideas about how it should change. And my wife is a high school and private school teacher with a PhD, and these people drive her out of her mind because you don't know anything about pedagogy, you don't have any idea how to teach, right? And it's, by the way, it's really hard to teach, and it's really, really hard to be good at it. And to then come in and be like, I've never been in a classroom except when I was a student, but let me tell you how I think you should do, The one problem that they never want to tackle, which also blows my mind, is poverty. And they like to say, I came here because I like to really solve big problems. That's what really turns me on, is trying to solve big, hairy problems. It's like, you live in San Francisco, right? You have walked around and looked around, haven't you? Have you thought about trying to fix that? Or like, my favorite thing was when they had, all these people, using the sidewalks as toilets, right? And they all complained without having any self-awareness that, like, you caused this. I mean, not entirely, but you really, exacerbated this. But also then the way they decided to deal with it was they came up with this app, and it was called Snap Crap, I think. And, because you remember there was a truck. There was a poop truck that would go around San Francisco and just find, this is true, right? They would find human excrement and scoop it up and throw it in the truck. It's true. This is true. And if you think the interns who have to edit out the ums and ahs have it back, just remind them, you're not working on the poop truck. So there was already a poop truck going around San Francisco, and Snap Crap was an app where when you saw a poo, you took a picture of it and then uploaded it to the office, the head poop guy, who would then dispatch the truck so they'd be very efficient at finding the poop, right? And it's like, did any of you just think of like maybe putting out more porta potties, just put more toilets out there? Did that not occur to you? Like, no, there's an app for that. We can fix this with an app. And same thing with poverty. Like, first of all, you're sitting on lots of money. Did you ever think of it as maybe giving some of it away? And I realize you can't just throw money at the problem, but like, it is a great problem, and technology really could be used to address it. And, it's a complex problem with a lot of moving parts, and you're not going to eradicate poverty completely. But it does really bother me that, like, when I was writing Lab Rats, that left Google a lunch where people there were telling me, well, we're all multimillionaires, but we're just regular rank and file people. We're not Google rich. Like back home in Indiana or wherever to our families, yeah, we're rich, sure. If we go on vacation, maybe we charter a private jet with another family. So, but like, then we come here and, people here are really rich. Like, they own 3 jets, And I was like, and then you drive from that, and like literally half a mile away, there's like an encampment of mobile homes that are all broken down. It's like these people's last gasp. If they couldn't afford their apartment anymore, they took the last bit of money they had. And then the techies all want them swept out because they hurt their property values. So, it's hilarious, but it's also, it makes you so angry, And I've gone way off your question, but
No, there's actually something that I want to pick up on this. In that book, Lab Rats, and I just want to give everybody the full title for emphasis, Lab Rats, How Silicon Valley Made Work Miserable for the Rest of Us. There's a chapter in that book that I think really kind of played things out for me in a way that I had not ever been able to kind of crystallize them before. That chapter starts out with a poignant scene of a limo driver in New York who has shot himself, with a suicide note talking about how rideshare services have made it impossible for him to make a living wage. Of course, Uber and Lyft drivers also don't make a living wage. Their sufficient earnings are priced under that of the limo drivers, which means that they also couldn't be making enough to survive. Meanwhile, Uber CEOs, Uber CFOs, Uber CMOs, Uber CSOs, etc., are making in excess of what they probably need to survive. The chapter really made me understand the crisis of wages and the deeply disturbing nature of wealth inequality. And I think for me, a fundamentally new and clear way, a way that I hadn't before. The disruption that the industry frequently talks about isn't just a matter that can be resolved by what they sometimes talk about, which is retraining people for new jobs. It makes me think that disruption is actually a really insidious word that's used to justify a really insidious form of capitalism, a form of capitalism that justifies calculated inequality in the name of what they call innovation, or quote innovation. Can you explain what you see happening from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I can say it as well as you just did, but this really does tie back to ethics, right? And I always think of tech ethics as being, we have to build an AI that has some sort of ethical understanding. But you're right. I mean, this is the weird ethical dilemma of this. For example, I think technology is great. Technology is just technology. what's great is or bad is how you use it. And I think the people who have found ways to prosper in the last 10 or 20 years in Silicon Valley have embraced this kind of, I call it hyper capitalism, but it's beyond shareholder capitalism. It's used to say shareholders come first, or investors come first. Now it's no, they're the only ones who come. Your other stakeholders, like your employees, to hell with them. Your customers, you're supposed to take care of them, but really you're just trying to extract as much money as you can from them. And I think, Uber's a great example. Like, yeah, it blew up the taxi industry, which, okay, we probably all hate taxis. I mean, it was a terrible system. You had to stand out and try to wave one down, call them the night before. So Uber did a great job of changing that, right? But then why couldn't they have just built that and paid people at least as well as taxi drivers? A taxi driver in New York can make a real living. He had a medallion, that limo driver. He had a really good living, or, he wasn't rich, but he had a solid living. And they just squeezed all that out in the name of, well, it helps the customer. But it really isn't about helping the customer. And it's very exploitative. I'm really bothered by it. Or you look at it another way. I sort of looked in that book, which, by the way, I think you're one of the 9 people who actually bought and read that book. But the idea of, when you look at when the internet began, or when it really caught on, became usable, right? And you see the first thing big companies did with it was outsource as much work as they could, right? There was this labor arbitrage. So intellectual work went to India and physical manufacturing went to China, but this blew out as much work as they could and hollowed out their companies. Okay, you say, okay, that's what tech does, and maybe that's super efficient. But, and the line is always that, but don't worry, because now tech is going to create all these new things, like a robot's going to take your job, but then you can go to work building the robots. But that didn't happen. When everybody got outsourced and pushed out of their decent middle-class lives, many of them union workers too, then Silicon Valley said, and guess what? Here's a gig. Guess what? You don't have a job anymore, but now you have a gig. And, you're not going to make any money. You're going to be a task rabbit or something. But we're also going to sell that as, isn't this great? If you work at Uber, you're your own boss and you're like an entrepreneur and you can make as much as you want and you set your own hours. It's like, why? I can't believe they can say that stuff and keep a straight face, right? It's just amazing to me. So yeah, I think they destroyed industries, but that wouldn't be bad if they replaced them with as good or even better industries. So for example, people who work in the cafeteria at Facebook, I have this in lab rats too. There's a couple, they both work in the cafeterias at Facebook. They have 2 kids, I think, and they're living in a converted garage because that's all they can afford, right? And I feel like, God, if you're running Facebook and you're making as much money as they have, everybody at Facebook should just be killing it, right? I mean, I grew up in a town that was in Massachusetts, and there's a huge factory. I think it was the biggest manufacturing facility in the AT&T or the Bell Labs network. And my dad worked, like basically everybody worked there. And my dad was a manager and he was an engineer, but there were a lot of jobs in the early days making circuits like by hand, like wiring circuits for telecom equipment. But where we lived, if you got a job on the line at Western Electric, it was like, oh my God, you've got it made. You can save money, you can buy a house, you can get a car, you can put your kids through college. It was a great, great job. And I just think it's inexcusable that Facebook doesn't do that for everybody who works, and that Uber doesn't do it for everybody who works.
I wanted to kind of pick up on that because there's a really kind of funny way in which this threads itself into season 2 of Silicon Valley, where we have the introduction of a new character, Russ Hanneman, a flashy billionaire, a member of what he calls the 3 Comma Club, who made his money by putting, get this guys, radio on the internet. He maintains a really flashy lifestyle in Silicon Valley. He has calf implants. That should tell you all you need to know. He owns numerous sports cars. He's really a parody of a type that I actually know very well in Silicon Valley. But he's just barely, I think, a parody. He's careless, he's somewhat clueless, and he's totally self-obsessed and totally unself-aware of how ridiculous he is. But people have to take him seriously because he's in the 3 Comma Club, aka billionaire. 3 commas refers to the 3 commas that separate the zeros in billion. I think that he gets at something critical about the relationship between Silicon Valley as a technological space full of dorky engineers and people driven by the idea of making a world a better place, and Silicon Valley as a money-centric, money-conscious space driven by self-interest. So how do we square that contradiction?
Great question. And it is complete contradiction. And I think, again, to go back to Silicon Valley as it existed before, in the days of HP. And, it was kind of, people made money, but, you weren't chasing after billions. I think it made it healthier that there wasn't even the chance to get that much. So you didn't put that much energy into trying to screw people, I think the amount of money in Silicon Valley, attracts people like Russ Hanneman, and also almost makes them want or more willing to be bad to the people around them because the rewards are so great. I will tell you a couple things about Russ Hanneman because I worked on that season. I only worked on season 2 and season 3. And I only worked in the season before they shot the show. So the way they worked it was they had a 12 or 14 week writing season where you all were locked in a room all day, 5 days a week, and just worked on whiteboards, right? And then you come up with scripts and then they shoot them. And while they're shooting, they also rewrite things. Then they have the actors improvise. And so often the show that makes it to the air would have nothing to do with the last version of the script that I saw. But it would also tell you, I was there when they were trying to figure out who is this guy. Like we wanted a character. I don't think we even had the name Russ Hanneman. For a while, we thought it should be like a Russian oligarch, like Yuri Milner. You know what I mean? Like, I'm Yuri Milner. And I was like, that season, I had rented a car from this like back alley guy down in Crenshaw who had it was like a chop shop. And like literally you had the hot wire. He said, no, the key doesn't know. If you put the key, then you touch these 2 wires. And he wasn't Russian, and we actually started all talking like he's the character, but it wasn't. And then, so finally, Russ Hanneman is Mark Cuban, all right? I saw all these articles of people like, I think he's this, I think he's that. No, he's Mark Cuban. And I'll tell you how directly Mark Cuban is. He is. I mean, first of all, Mark Cuban put radio on the internet, right? That's how he made his money, right? I'm going to put radio on the internet. And they were so obsessed with him. And he was shooting Shark Tank on the Sony lot where we were writing and shooting Silicon Valley. And they actually, Mike Judge and Alec Berg, actually, through connections with him, set up a lunch with Mark Cuban. And under the guise of like, we're talking to people in Silicon Valley to get ideas and blah, 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 right? But it was completely so that Mike Judge could just sit there and get him, do a Mark Cuban. And he came back, and Mike Judge can imitate anybody. And it was just like, okay, we got him. Like they totally tricked him. They just wanted him to talk and talk and talk so they could figure out how can we build a character around him. And they did that. God, they did that over and over to people. And we would go on these. There would be always a field trip at the beginning of the writing season. And we'd go up to Silicon Valley and meet Mark Andreessen, who was so pathetic and just pitching ideas and almost saying, please, can I get a cameo? It was but they were sort of looking for we knew in season 2 that Pied Piper was going to have this big, season 1 ends with them winning that TechCrunch competition. And the assignment was, okay, season 2 is the next morning, what happens, right? And we were like, well, every VC would be on their front lawn, right? But then Hooli will sue them. And why would Hooli sue them? Because that's what they do. But Hooli copied them. It's yeah, but this is what IBM does. They go in and they sue you, and you can't afford to fight it and then just take your stuff. It's like foreplay. They just beat you up until you have no money. And then they say, well, we'll buy your stuff. So we were coming up with all those kind of ideas. And Russ Hanneman, I don't know how he fit into why we had to, because we needed somebody to bail them out. That was right. Nobody would touch them. Nobody would invest in them. And so then we were like, we need somebody to come along like a white knight, because I think when we met with Andreessen Horowitz, we'd ask them what would happen if a company got sued? We wouldn't say we wouldn't tell them it's going to be the show. What if hypothetically a little startup got sued by Google? Would they be able to go raise a round? No, they'd be poisoned, radioactive, nobody would invest. So check, okay, that one works. But literally also, I kind of, not was annoyed, I was sort of more amused that when I was working on the show, I would read people writing about the show and saying things that the way I would view TV too is I think what they're trying to say is this week's episode is more of an analogy about this or this and that. And this is the kind of big statement they're trying to make. And I swear to God, no one ever, ever, ever had any conversation like that at all. It was literally okay, they don't have any money. Shit, what works now? Let's have a rich guy bail them out. Okay. And then it was okay, then what happens next? I don't know. Or also we would sit in the room and be you got a great little story going. And it's Richard and Jared and Ehrlich, right? And then we'd be oh shit, there's nothing for Dinesh in here. And like in TV, you can't just have an episode where Dinesh doesn't show up, right? You have to, what do they call it? Mouths to feed. So they have to be like, oh shit, we need a B story and it has to be something about Dinesh. And like, oh, how about Dinesh wears a chain? Like it was literally always just so desperately trying to make the plot work and the jokes funny, and that it had nothing to do with the grandiose thematic things. And now I feel when I watch TV, I watch it in a different way because I'm like, I bet those guys are just sitting there, just trying to get ahead of the next episode. But anyway, Russ Hanneman, though, didn't turn out to be brilliant. Remember, he had the car doors that went up. He's like, I don't want these kind of doors. I need these kind of doors, And that was just, once they had him, and once they had Cuban, there were some really funny guys in that room, and they could just make shit up. Like I would watch them and go like, oh my God, these guys, because they've been doing comedy for 20 years. They've been sitting in that rooms like that since Seinfeld. And we would watch them play tennis, like two of them just bouncing. One says a joke, the other says a joke. They keep yes-anding each other and getting sicker and sicker and sicker. I actually was amazed. I was like, I used to think I was funny, and now I realize, no, I'm really not funny. These guys are funny. I would pitch something that I thought was funny, and they'd be like, just stick to the plot. Okay, you're good on plot, and good on plot is a euphemism for not funny.
I mean, I worked in startups before I went into academia, and I had a CEO as my boss who was Russ Hanneman to a T. So that was well accomplished. Just to pick up on something that you said there, I'm curious, did writing about Silicon Valley through humor change the way you thought about that space? And if so, how?
Yeah, well, especially with the fake Steve thing, right? Because first of all, it really took off and it was hilarious. And I realized, a lot of other people get this, and they like it. Well, also, they're the Apple fans too. But yeah, it actually fed back into my real journalism in a way. Because I was doing both for a while. I was doing, even after I got caught, because I was anonymous at first, which was really fun. But even after I was outed and everybody knew it was me writing it, and then I went to Newsweek and we had to say, oh, by the way, I had to call them and be like, hey, I'm going to be covering you guys now. They were not happy about that, right? But yeah, it made me, first of all, it made me take it less seriously, just kind of see the ridiculousness of it. But also, I don't think satire can be really powerful. It's a really powerful way to actually say true things, right? In a way that you couldn't say just straight. So yeah, it made me even more cynical about Silicon Valley.
And just to trace the route that you just summarized, you reported on tech for Forbes, I believe, before launching into what might be the funniest spots on the web, at least I think so, which is, as you mentioned, the Fake Steve account, which is a parody blog that was set up as a diary of Steve Jobs, of course, the fake Steve Jobs. Maybe you could tell us how you started writing about the most important facts of Silicon Valley, and then how you got to writing about that space through comedy.
So I had like the most boring job in tech journalism in the world. Like I was on the East Coast, so I didn't get to cover all the cool companies like Sun Microsystems and all those guys, right? And I had to leave that to the reporters in the Silicon Valley there. So I got IBM, right? And like EMC. Once in a while, Dell. Well, these companies are not fun to write about. IBM is just, a fate worse than death. And I also had a lot of free time on my hand. And I also realized just about this time that something was changing in journalism, in media. And it was this, that for a long time, the magazine was the flagship, and the .com side was really, the minor leagues. And it was where you got demoted to. If you really didn't cut it in the magazine, you would get moved off to the .com. And it was very, very blatant. And the .com guys hated it. Those people resented us on the magazine side, on the print side. And I find that split still exists today. I've had PR people say in the last year, oh, is that going to be in print or on the web? And they definitely think it's less. But at that time, I realized, no, print is dead. Print, this is going away. And for better or worse, it's going to be online. And I don't know how old I was, in my 40s. And if I don't do this now, I'm going to get laid off and I'm not going to know anything about online journalism, right? So I actually went to the editor of Forbes and said, look, I want to transfer to the .com. And they're like, what? And I was like, yeah, I want to go work over there. I want to learn how to blog. I want to learn how to do all this stuff. And I figured they'd be like, wow, okay. And instead, the .com guys were like, nah, yeah, no thanks. Then I was shocked because I thought, really, I'm really going to be out of it. And so I thought I'm going to start blogging. I just got to learn how to blog. I didn't care what the content was. I think there was a WordPress, Blogger, and there was a third one. And I just started creating blogs on all of them. And one was like, my real blog. And stuff that was left over when I wrote a story for Forbes, or a little interesting aspect that, maybe I didn't put in the story, or just commentary. But then I started looking at all these other things, right? And Robert Scoble, right? He's not as well known now, but at the time he was, had a lot of influence. And it was in the early days of blogging when they were like, every CEO is going to have a blog. You're not going to need to talk to reporters. You're not going to need to have that, that intermediary. You're just going to go straight to your audience. And isn't that great? And I thought, based on every CEO I've ever met, no, that is not going to be great. That's a really bad idea, Robert. And one guy tried it. It's the CEO of Sun, Jonathan something or other. And he had got a ponytail, and he was like the cool guy. But, everything they wrote was all fake and stiff. And then somehow I thought, what if one of these guys did do this and went off the rails and was kind of drinking and getting high and at home, and they couldn't stop him? Basically what Trump ended up being on Twitter, right? And he's a real sociopath, and he's a total asshole. And he can reveal that here, And I tried Sergey Brin, and that didn't work. And somehow I landed on Steve Jobs. And also, Apple at the time wasn't really so big. The iPhone hadn't come out. They had 2% market share in computers. I used to write things like, new quarterly numbers are out. We're up to 2.3. Watch out, assholes. We're coming for you. It was such a joke that Apple would ever be a rival to Microsoft, right? So it was really fun because they were he was this random guy who was kind of thought very highly of himself and was very precious and very I'm such a perfectionist, but had this tiny market share, so that's hilarious. So I started writing it, and I didn't even realize, I was so new to blogging, I didn't realize you could see how many people were reading it. And then I found that, and I was like, oh shit, there's 1,000 people reading this. Who the hell, where are these people? And then I thought, oh, you can see where they are in the world. Oh my God, right? And it was just such a rush. And then I thought, no, I better stop this, because if I get caught, my career will be over. And by the way, I based it on, there's a British humor magazine called Private Eye, and they always have the diary. And I used to think it was hilarious because they would do exactly that. It would be some preposterous person being preposterous. So I stopped. I shut it down. And suddenly there was this online, people were like, hey, what happened? What happened to fix it? I thought, oh my God, people are actually talking about the blog that I didn't know was reading. And then worse, somebody else started it back up, pretending to be fake Steve Jobs. That's where the name comes. It's I'm fake Steve. And I got so mad that I opened mine back up, and it's no. I'm the real fake Steve. That's the fake Steve, right? Because you're not going to take no. And his stuff sucked, right? Whoever it was. So then it was just off to the races, and it went from 1,000 to 10,000 to 100 to 1,000,000. And I was the New York Times wrote about it, and that got me more. It was just one of those things. It was, you went for the ride, and it was intoxicating. It was a drug. I could not stop. A couple times I thought, it's wearing me out. I do this all day. I don't focus on anything else in my life. But then I would be walking along and be like, oh, Steve would say that, it'd be so what if Steve had a conversation with Steven Spielberg? That'd be funny. It was so much fun.
And I think it also gets at something that, the kind of straight on business writing can't get at. I think it really triangulates, or at least puts together different pieces through kind of not naming the farcical dimension of Silicon Valley life, or this kind of corporate CEO cult figurehood life that you wouldn't be able to name if you were just kind of doing a straight on reporting job on it. There's something that came up that I wanted to ask you about with regard to kind of the relationship between straight on business reporting and these kind of alternative forms. I've heard you say elsewhere that if you read what business writers write and then you listen to them talk about what they really think when they get together and hang out, what they say in those kinds of conversations that remain unwritten is very, very different. And I've heard you say it this way, that while it wasn't like you weren't telling the truth in print, there was something very different going on about those conversations. But at the time, you weren't able to get your head around what the difference was. But that was something you said in 2007. It's 2021. Any luck since then putting your finger on it?
Oh my God. It made me feel so old. It was so long ago. Yeah, it was not in private they'd be like, oh, that product sucks, or that stock is a piece of crap. And then they'd write about it going, hey, go buy that stock. It wasn't like that. It was the nuance of the place. We all knew there's this PR person that you have to deal with when you go there. And oh my God, they're such a nightmare, But you can't put that in the story because that's your headache. Readers don't care. And yeah, I think it was just the satire allowed me to flesh it out, and often I'd get it right. I'd be like, ooh, it turns out that person really is that evil, and like it was all of us knew everybody that we're talking to. We all kind of knew, not gossip, like who's having an affair. We just knew like, this guy thinks he's a jerk. This guy thinks he's cool, whatever. So it was very easy to like dish that through a different character. It's just a way. It would be like, if you, like Scott McNeely, who was the CEO of Sun Microsystems, was completely full of shit, and just loved himself and was kind of a bully. And basically kind of an asshole. And he sort of traded on that. He always had these good quotes and like hated Microsoft. He picked these ridiculous fights with Microsoft. And it would be like, but I had to write a regular story about him once, and they were nominated for Company of the Year, and Scott. But meanwhile, while I'm interviewing him, he's like, "So you're the guy who wrote that story about our thing? You got that all wrong, you fucking idiot." Yeah, look at him, and I just started laughing. Yeah, look at you laughing at me. You're just laughing about it. Yeah, you shouldn't even be talking to me. Like he was like that, And you wanted to write the story and say, like Scott McNeely, who is a complete asshole and bullshit artist, said that this year, like, it's all you could do is like kind of like let them talk and let them show up. So this was in 2001, and it was like everybody thinks the bubble's going to burst, and Sun has made all its money, selling really expensive computers to every startup. And I was like, so Scott, like, what happens? This isn't going to last forever. What if there's a crash? He's like, I actually think if there's a crash, it's even better for us because we're the best value and people are going to buy even more of our stuff. And it was like, dude, that is so fucking stupid, right? Like, and I'm like, I can't wait to write that, and of course, the market crashed. They ended up going out of business, they collapsed and got bought by Oracle. But it was like, oh, you know what? Every time, some company is going along and then Microsoft enters its space with its own product, or now it would be Google, when Google enters Snapchat space. And they always say, we think this is great. The competition just validates the space. And that's not what they really think. They're like, ah. So yeah, it was things like that you couldn't really say, quote someone and then go, like, what do they say on Twitter? Someone says something and then they say narrator : in fact, he was not that. Like you always wanted to put that voice into your story, but you can't do that, So it's more like that.
Well, speaking of Mythbusters, in your book Disrupted, which has been called, just to give a little plug here, the best book about Silicon Valley by no less than the LA Times, you wrote that myth and myth-making are rampant in Silicon Valley. And you continue, I wrote this book because I wanted to provide a more realistic look at life inside a, quote, unicorn startup and to puncture the popular mythology about heroic entrepreneurs. Inside Silicon Valley, you saw that leaders were not heroes, I'm quoting you here, but rather a pack of sales and marketing charlatans who spun a good story about magical transformational technology and got rich by selling shares in a company that still has never turned a profit. I'm ending the quote there. Now, you and I share a connection to Julie Albright, who was on the podcast a few months ago to talk about mythology in tech. And when I talk about the ethics of technology, I often talk about the governing myths around tech production. For example, that each new product will, quote, make our lives better, or that all innovation is, quote, progress. What are you referring to when you talk about the popular mythology of heroic entrepreneurs? What is that mythology?
Well, short answer is it's the hero's journey, right? And I did an MFA in creative writing. So yeah, you're a lit professor, so you get this, right? But every company has to have a story and there's always a creation myth, right? So even if things never happen in a really neat, tidy way, they're usually messy at the beginning and they're trying this and they're trying that. But after the fact, once they start getting traction, they go back and create this thing of like, we were sitting around and we thought, wow, what if you could do that? Blah, blah, blah. Like I had this problem and I tried to stuff. They just manufacture that myth. And then then you're going to try to go public. So you need a leading man. It's always a man. I'm sorry, right? Pretty much always a guy. And he has to look like Mark Zuckerberg and he has to seem like, a tech hero, right? He has to be kind of good looking. Evan Spiegel is a great example of this, and he's your hero. I used to think when I was working at a company, we were ramping toward an IPO. I was talking to my boss and I said, an IPO is just a story, right? All we're selling is a story. We're going out to the world, we put out a prospectus and we just tell a story. And then we say, and guess what happens next? It gets even better, right? It was just a story. So you even had like the descent into the underworld, because the company always, when you're writing a story about a company, you couldn't just say, these guys are great. You always had to have but then adversity struck. and they had to figure out their way out of this thing, and it seemed like they were going to die. With Tesla, right? They almost ran out of money, but then Elon Musk, the hero of the story, came back and he did this great thing because he's a hero. And I think people like myths, people like stories. It's how we make sense of the world. And so these companies have just figured out how to do it. I'll tell you one thing. I had a friend who was a venture capitalist who told me literally this, because he went to Emerson College, which is a big film school, but he became a money guy. And he said, you know how I look at a company where I invest in them? It's a movie. I'm the producer. I put up the money. As soon as I give them money, I'm trying to figure out how I can boost the value in the next round so I make money. And then I find it a founder. I want it to be, he's my hero. He's my main character. I want a story that makes him like a hero. And then the IPO is opening weekend and I want asses in the seats, right? And then I cash out. He saw the whole thing was a story to him. And then that was mind blowing to me. And I thought that is exactly how those guys do it. So yeah, I think it's all about mythology. And we like to think these guys are heroes, that they're special, that they're smarter than everybody else,
One of the things I grapple with living and working in the context of Silicon Valley is the sense in which, in general, I'm not talking about, in general, terrible people or scheming people. I think that generally, living and working in the context of Silicon Valley, I find that when I go about my daily business and interact with people, the people who work in tech in Silicon Valley seem kind of like generally good people. Big tech campuses, the ones where we accuse them of terrible ethical conduct sometimes, seem like great places to work, with Edenic campuses and amenities and endless events and parties and camaraderie. And the people who work there graduate from good progressive schools. They love Karl Marx decals for their MacBook Pros, and they might download a podcast about Deleuze and Guattari on their Stitcher app. And they probably have a hard copy of Yuval Noah Harari's Sapiens. All of these thinkers, by the way, critique much of or exactly what these tech workers do. And they find Silicon Valley hilarious, even though it's kind of skewering them. How do we understand the relationship between this culture of good people, or the feel-good culture and utopic vision of Silicon Valley on the one hand, and on the other hand, the production of culture you describe often in terms that are deeply disturbing as deeply perhaps dystopian or predatory capital, or these kinds of unethical practices?
First of all, I want to say you're probably the only tech podcast that's ever mentioned Deleuze, if that's how you pronounce it. And I just know the name because I went to grad school with English lit people like you. But I think that's hilarious. And yes, to your later point about they love to read these books by people who are skewering them, there is this weird masochistic thing where they even bring those people in, like, come in and talk to us and advise our CEO. And it's like, yeah, we think you're assholes. Oh God, tell me more, and they don't change, but they just like to hear it, I guess. I think because often they're people that no one ever tells them anything except what they think they want to hear. So it's maybe refreshing for them to get that. I never got that. They just think I'm an asshole. They never say, hey, come in and, tell us we're assholes to our face. Like, we'll pay you for it. Like, no, I don't get that stuff. I agree with you on the people, though. Pretty much everybody I've met, most people I've met in technology have been fantastic people. I've made really, really good friends from people I covered. Microsoft is a great example. They have such a terrible reputation. They were the Borg, they were the big bad company. But I will tell you, all through the time I ever covered Microsoft, they and their PR people were just the nicest people you ever met. Like, great people to hang out with, really, really cool people with integrity. And Google, I've been to Google a couple of times, and I did authors at Google or whatever they call it, and really, really, really nice people. You're right. And really smart, like the kind of people you'd like to hang out with. And I think it's sort of touched on in that documentary, The Social Dilemma, that none of these people set out to do bad things, but somehow along the way, they end up doing it. And then I think there's a way in which they manage to not look at it. You know what I mean? They manage to not see what's going on and just keep going with what they're doing. And it's not that they're actively evil. It's just that you don't want to see it, so you just don't see it. But yeah, I don't know. I think there's a very interesting conundrum that, I don't know, did you see The Social Dilemma? Did you see that?
Yeah, I've seen The Social Dilemma. I actually had a really interesting conversation with a scholar over at Berkeley, Morgan Ames, who writes about Silicon Valley's moral vision. And one of the things that we talked about that I think is potentially a theory with some traction is that, if you go to a campus every day that's built like a utopian Eden, and if you're offered free snacks and constantly told that you're connecting the world, then you don't stop to think about how the algorithm you just engineered maybe ends up engineering a genocide in Myanmar because everybody is telling you you're so great and the campus around you looks like a utopia. And there's I think, even larger disconnect between what you do, which is play ping pong and have Lego practices and get free snacks, and the fact that these consequences are so severe in other parts of the world. A second theory that I've been working with and thinking about quite a bit is that an idea like connecting the world, a Mark Zuckerberg idea of what he thinks he's doing with Facebook, is a particularly Silicon Valley, particularly kind of, white male understanding of what happens when you put people who are very different from one another in contexts where they are constantly in dialogue and conversation with one another. I heard somebody say, and I loved it, so I will repeat it. If that were truly the case for most people, Jerusalem would be a very different place. So I think that some of those theories and some of the ideas come out of a context of a really sheltered place, and that one of the consequences of a lack of diversity in the context of tech, and one of the consequences of a Silicon Valley utopian kind of texture to the landscape itself, as well as to the business day, might actually be to inhibit workers' ability to see the kinds of consequences that their work engineers.
So the environment they're in actually prohibits them or makes it difficult or impossible for them to see the negative consequences of their work. Yeah.
I had Dave Eggers on the podcast too. We talked about his book, which was then made into a movie, The Circle, where something like that actually happens. I think that he underscores that dimension of the work in a really emphatic way.
I remember when I watched The Social Dilemma, early on, there's this great little sequence where everybody they're interviewing, they say, so what's the problem? What's wrong? We're causing, and they all go, like, nobody can think of the problem. And I said, they're going, no, the problem is us. It's human beings, right? Like, we take, assholes just project their assholeness onto a new platform. So those scammers who used to scam one way now have another place to scam. And yeah, there's ways to swing elections. But, then at the same time, it's not all bad. I was talking to my daughter today. She's 15. She brought up something really interesting. Oh, it was this Reykjavik thing that happened 20 years ago where in Iceland, they got all these people to confess to crimes by putting them in solitary confinement and then found out that it was all untrue. We were talking about solitary confinement. And I said to my daughter, like, did you hear that? Was that in class or something? She said, no, I saw it on YouTube. And I realized, like, that's how my daughter and my son, they're both 15. They learn a lot of stuff just because they're self-directed, and that stuff's on YouTube. But then there's all this sort of junk food on TikTok and YouTube. And then there's really, really bad, awful stuff on YouTube. And I think it all sort of lives alongside itself. And it's kind of too easy to just think it's all negative. It's not a good, bad, binary split.
By the way, I took the Lego therapy and the ping pong from Lab Rats as well. So maybe I can ask you another question about that book. In that book, you start off with a welcome from a voice that sounds like a HR manager onboarding a new hire. And after listing off a ridiculous and sobering litany of the insults that the employee can expect to receive upon receiving employment, that list includes, by the way, African Americans and Latinos need not apply. And it ends with, we do not offer daycare. We do offer ping pong. It's hilarious, but I think it also get deeply troubling about the way that seemingly welcome, inclusive tech companies gatekeep the way that they then curate the environment. I mean, if you offer amenities like ping pong and free snacks and all interactive Lego play-based leadership training events and an open bar, why not also offer childcare? To me, the justifications about team building through Lego play, backed by brain science or behavioral psychology studies that indicate that employees maybe work longer when they're provided snacks, they seem a little bit like they're attempts to use science-backed studies, or at least pop science-backed studies, to justify superfluous, flashy incentives that seem to appeal mostly to upper-class men, while not providing things that actually many women in the workforce, or perhaps underrepresented minorities in the workforce, actually need in order to do their jobs, like childcare. Actually, the more I think about it, the more it seems to me that the overspending and the overrepresentation of things like ping pong offerings and Lego play leadership training and snacks are maybe a way that these companies can seem sympathetic to employees, particularly the ones underrepresented in tech, without actually providing them any infrastructure that they actually need. Am I being too cynical?
No, God, that was so great. You just put it all together. And I wanted to talk, I was writing notes as you were saying things. But yeah, the whole world is built for young white men. And the companies they come up with are things like, oh, they call it like the apps that my mom used to do for me. Like, oh, you can get your laundry delivered. Somebody can bring you food. You don't have to learn how to cook. And like, wouldn't that be awesome? It's like, no, dude, I know how to cook. I really know. I do my own laundry. I'm a grown man. I can do these things. But so that's one part of it. And then the aspect around women is amazing to me. In that list that you read, that sort of, I think it was called like Welcome to the Company. It was sort of, if they gave you a real employee manual and told you the real truth. I've actually been thinking about doing a blog or even a mini book that was just like the real employee handbook and write it in the voice of this made up CEO who's anonymous and is going to tell you what he really thinks. But like, yeah, okay, if you are a woman and you work here, you should expect to be sexually harassed. You should also know that if you complain to HR, you will be fired, right? Just know this. This is the reality, and they'll pay lip service to it. The thing that bothers me most is the lip service to diversity. And it really, really bothers me, I guess, because I started thinking about it in terms of age bias and then sort of discovered at a very late age, intersectionality. I was talking to a friend about a woman I've known since college who grew up where I grew up in Massachusetts, a Black woman who's been in PR. Now she's a professor and worked in like public television, public radio in Hollywood a little bit. And I said, Marcy, this is so weird because, these people just don't even listen to me just because I'm old. And, I can't, there's nothing I can do. I can't hide that I'm old. I can't, even if I dye my hair or, try to wear hipper clothes, I can't hide it. I just, I can't go back and make myself 30. And she said to me, dude, welcome to my whole fucking life. I'm a Black woman. I was like, oh shit. Yeah. And I talked a lot more with her and other people. I don't get how they keep getting away with this bullshit about African Americans. It just really, really bothers me. I don't even, not that I don't know why. I don't know why it bothers me more than anything else. Because I feel like it's, the movie Hidden Figures about the 3 Black women who worked at NASA in the 60s and helped do the math that put astronauts on the moon or into orbit, It occurred to me, a Black woman today at Apple or any other Silicon Valley company is even more isolated than those 3 Black women were at NASA a half century ago. And that is astounding. Like, I almost think you have to go out of your way to have that few people of color in your industry. You have to. I mean, how could you, even in Boston, which is a very segregated city, I would look around that company and go, look at that. There are 500 people here and pretty much all of them look exactly the same, just young white kids who look like they hang out at Cape Cod. They dress the same. It was just cookie cutter people. And I don't know. And they also always treat diversity as like, they don't say it, but they're like, oh, it'd be nice to do. We'll hire a, diversity officer and blah, blah, blah. But, we don't want to slow down. We don't have to slow down to worry about this when we're just charging ahead. And it's like, well, really? And then they also say the thing like, we're not going to lower our standards. And I hear that and I'm like, you know what? Fuck you. And I don't know. I think it's just, you're right. It's just young white men who have essentially been told all their lives that they're great. From the time they were in kindergarten on, they were just the greatest. And they can't see themselves in any real way.
I wanted to actually ask you about ageism in tech and the consequences of that, not just on the individual who experiences it, but for the work sector and for the culture, but also for the consequences on ideation and development of products themselves. I've been quite concerned about the growing disregard for expertise, much of which is aggregated in people who have had more experience. And one way, and one important way, I think, to accumulate experience is to be around for a while. Being around for a while, watching things change, seeing how people work, having some life experience is gaining the advantage of a longer perspective, the kind of perspective that I think you need to be a little bit more humble, the kind of perspective that you maybe need in order to know a little bit about the fact that you might not be you might not have some sort of like radical new idea that is great, but and nobody else has done it because they're not as smart as you, but perhaps because there are some negative consequences to it. I don't know that there are shortcuts to getting that kind of advantage that one only, I think, can get from a longer perspective. What role do you think that Silicon Valley's well-acknowledged age bias has on its functionality and for its creative output?
I once wrote an article on LinkedIn called "When It Comes to Age Bias, Tech Companies Don't Even Bother to Lie," or something like that. Or like with race and gender, they'll at least say, "Oh, we're not doing so well. We're trying to do better." But with age, they're like, "No, young people are smarter." And I think part of it is all those things you said about age and experience and wisdom and the value of people to the workplace is they're all true. But that's if you assume that someone is trying to make a company that will really last and be, a sustainable company. And a lot of these are just churn and burn. They're just chop shops. They're boiler rooms. And they're just trying to sprint as fast as they can to the IPO, cash out, figure it out later. You know what I mean? They'll cut ethical corners, just do whatever you can do to get to that thing. And, if you want to, when I wrote in Disrupt, they had a boiler room full of like these, white bros, just cold calling. And I thought, if you do want to have a culture where it's just like, you guys got to be really competitive. You got to do the same boring thing over and over, ring the bell when you get it. You're super competitive. Who better than young, kind of dumb white guys who like played lacrosse in college? There's no thinking, right? Those guys are great for that. The other thing is, I think it's about discomfort. I just think old people make young people uncomfortable. If you're a young manager, you got to manage someone who's like your parents' age, remind you of your dad. It's hard to manage that person. Also, it's just hard to relate to them. Or even if you're not managing them, you're working alongside them. The same thing with Black people. It makes everybody uncomfortable and blah, blah, blah. Like, oh, I don't want to say the wrong thing. So let's just not hire any. You know what I mean? Then we don't have to step on any grenades. I think a lot of it was just that when I was working with people. And it's weird because when I began my career, it was at a newspaper, daily paper. And I was in college and right out of college. And there were all these old sports writer guys who were like, almost retirement age, hilarious old guys who could never figure out how to use the computers. So they'd be like, "Come over here, tell me how do I get this goddamn thing?" But then they would teach us how to write, because we didn't know how to write at all. And we all hung out. We went drinking. It was great. I'm like, wow, I'm hanging out with guys like my grandfather's age. This is amazing. And they're cool. They're really cool. But I think, Silicon Valley has lost that. And God knows they don't need to hire older people. There's plenty of young people coming along. I hear people feeling they're getting aged out at 30. Can you imagine? Like at 30, like, sorry, bye. I don't know. It's ridiculous. And I think you're right. If you're trying to sell or design products that appeal to everybody, but you only have young white guys, the people making the product should sort of be like the people you want to sell the products to.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that. Part of my argument in thinking about the ethics of technology really has to do with the fact that it's not just good in terms of creating a moral good to hire people who are diverse to work on a project. It's actually critical for the value of the product. You're in Boston, so you might know the context for this story. There was a study done on MIT's campus, and they looked at one building on MIT's campus that has created more intellectually significant outputs than anywhere else on the campus. And they started to inquire as to why. And they looked at the building, and the building was this kind of dilapidated place. It was not one of the nicer buildings on MIT's campus. And it was a building where they put everybody who didn't quite fit in to any other department, or the people who weren't kind of the superstar people in a department. And the building was old. So they had a mishmash of different people from different intellectual, methodological backgrounds cohabitating in the same space. And in the context of that, they also gave them a building that was not very nice. And so people felt okay spilling things and breaking down walls and talking to one another in a way that they might not in a more prestigious building. And out of that kind of environment, they have more, I think, creative consequences. And I think that it's an important study in that, the more you include people from a broad spectrum of experiences and backgrounds and biases, the more likely you are to have a product that better serves more people, and the less likely you are to put out something that deeply, deeply disadvantages or causes a lot of negative consequences for a couple of different groups.
Yeah, and just totally misses. Like you spend all this time and the product comes out and says, Boom. But yeah, I didn't know that story about the MIT building, but it makes sense to me. What I think is, if you're running companies the way they are, it's just stupid for you. I mean, they always treat diversity as this nice thing to do. Look at us, it's like philanthropical. It's like, no, dude, you're running a company that relies on brain power, and you're telling 75% of the world, yeah, sorry, don't need you. Maybe more than 70. A vast swath of the world is like, no, I'm not going to look at you because it's too hard. We'll just take white bros coming out of Stanford. And it's like, look at the brain power you're missing out on. Like, how stupid is that? And yeah, I think so. Part of it is just you're ruling out lots of talent that would help you. But also, I think you're right. There is something about people from different backgrounds, different domain expertise, right? That you put them together, and they don't all have to be, quote, I hate this term, but like rock stars, but they're just something about that. I don't know if it's friction or the way, I don't know, you'd know this better than I would, but it's something about the way people interact and what comes out of that. I think the real risk of a lack of diversity is you also have this monoculture, and you get a lack of vision because everybody thinks the same thing. And so it's how do you get anything creative when nobody disagrees? I mean, you kind of have to disagree politely.
I mean, the way that I describe it is that if I have a thought and I keep it in my head, then I will go in feedback loops, reifying the thought that I ever have. But as soon as I extract it, and you might know this as a writer, as soon as I extract that thought, I get some critical distance from it, I put it down on paper, then I have some distance between me and my thought. Now, if I extract it from my brain, I get that critical distance, and I hand it off to somebody else for refinement who can hold it up to scrutiny. They can then refine my thought. And, there's a kind of system of both checks and balances and refinement and molding and crafting in generative ways that happens in that process of exchange. That's one definition of what I would call both creativity and also kind of a search for a more valuable kind of idea.
I mean, isn't it amazing when you have a good editor or a friend who's just a great reader and you give them something? I did workshops a lot too, as a creative writer. And they come back and you're like, oh, wow, like you saw this thing that I didn't even see because I'm like down in the weeds with this. And I would almost seek it out, like I've been lucky. I've worked with really amazing editors, and they always just open up new things. And one of my favorite, I read recently that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I read one of her books. And she said that when she would be writing an opinion, she would always go to Scalia to read it. First, because he was a friend, but also because he was so ideologically opposite to her. She knew he would just find every weakness in her argument and her logic. And that was what helped her. So she was able to, like you say, kind of put some distance between you and the work. You're not hurting my feelings. You're helping my product.
No, that's one of the reasons I have these conversations. Dan, in this case of art imitating life, imitating art, my technically human students are at this very moment hard at work writing the 2021 Cal Poly Ethical Technology Manifesto. Famously, in the last season of Silicon Valley, the fallen CEO Gavin Bilson, who's the villain of the show, who's greedy, power-hungry, vain, diabolically intent in ruining the protagonist's small startup, decides that to regain his stature in Silicon Valley, he's going to spearhead an ethics campaign, and he's going to force everyone else in the industry to sign it as a pledge of the Technological Ethical Conduct Manifesto, or what he calls TEThics, the Tethical Manifesto. It's laughable. You're laughing. It is laughable, both because his entire career has been in violation of ethical principles and conduct, but it's also laughable because, as we find out, he has taken the entire content of the manifesto from different menus or pamphlets from places like the AARP or Applebee's or Starbucks. The statements, one is enhance the quality of life for all ages, which is taken from the AARP, are so broad, so cliche, so sloganeering that they could belong arbitrarily on either an AARP pamphlet or on an Applebee's or a Starbucks menu. And I show this episode, I use it to talk to my students and give them an example about the importance of avoiding cliches, about the significance of being specific. And I show it to them to exemplify why slogans are so meaningless. If your statement about ethics and technology is so broad that it can either belong on a Starbucks menu or on a directive about the ethics of technology, it is probably too broad to really mean anything or to hold anybody accountable to any specific policy or set of conduct. Silicon Valley is, of course, and I'm speaking of the place here, full of slogans. Do you see a relationship between slogans or language broadly and some of the unethical character of Silicon Valley? And if so, how would you describe that connection?
I don't know if there's a connection. I do. Let me think. Things like don't be evil, right? I always crack me up. What does that mean? You know what I mean? Don't be evil. That's the only rule. Because they like to say we don't have rules. We just trust you to be adults. You know, don't be a bonehead. That's like, don't be a butthead. That's our rule. You know, but I suppose you're right. You know, in a sense, because they're so meaningless, that you're basically free to do whatever you want and to be as awful as you want underneath it, because it gives you this sort of umbrella over your head, right? I do think the Gavin Bell thing is pretty funny, but I'm always wary of anybody has to, when you try to write a manifesto. I think it's a pretty scary thing, and it usually is attached to something that's not very good, right? And people who write manifestos are like the Unabomber or something. And I'd be interested to see what your students are coming up with. You know, what is it meant to be? What's the ethical technology manifesto?
So it is a code of conduct for Cal Poly that we are going to hold ourselves and the administration accountable to in terms of ethical technology practices. And the way that I think of manifestos, you know, I don't give them like Karl Marx's Communist Manifesto. I give them forms of writing that don't usually go by the name manifesto, but are actually, if you look at the structure of them in terms of the generic template that they're writing within, manifestos. So for example, I give them the speech by the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., I Have a Dream, which in form and in genre is a manifesto. I give them the Declaration of Independence, which again follows the kind of skeleton structure of a manifesto. And they use that skeleton structure to really kind of tease out the different dimensions of what a vision for ethical technology that they envision, that they want to hold us as instructors and administration and themselves as accountable to.
Yeah, I think because the exercise of writing it forces you to actually think about it, right? To tease out those ideas, right? So forcing yourself to put it down in writing is probably a way to actually even think about it. I mean, I don't even know what would the code of conduct be? What would be ethical? What would be unethical in terms of the technology you're developing?
So they talk about all of it. You know, the way that I kind of frame it for them is that I talk about both the framers of the Constitution and the writers of the Declaration of Independence. I talk about Dr. King, and I say that these are figures who are not in the biblical sense, but in the modern sense, what we would call the figure of the prophet. What does a prophet do? A prophet doesn't divine ideas from God, not in the modern sense. What we understand a prophet to be able to do is to have a vision of how the world could or should be, not how it is, but how it could or should be. And then through language to be able to articulate that vision and vivify it and animate it and make it so real for those who are listening to that vision that they too can see a world that does not yet exist, but could in potentiality exist, and then design the world in that vision. That's like a kind of magical, wonderful thing. And the aim of the manifesto is to both kind of set out the philosophical structure and then really detail the kinds of policies behind that would undergird that. And what my question is about and what the concern is about is that when you have a piece of language or a term or a slogan or what I call the cliche that is so broad that it can belong both on an Applebee's menu and on an ethical technology manifesto, then you're really kind of evading the responsibility for holding anybody accountable to that, because you know your vision is unclear in that sense. I have a longer theory of cliches that I won't bore you with, but
I'd like to hear it, because you know there's a phrase in Boston for people like you, and you know we say you're wicked smart. You are wicked smart.
I used to live in Boston, so I know.
Oh, so you know, right? Yeah. Wicked smart. And that is like, wow. I mean, that is really heavy stuff. But are these your students? Are they engineers and they're taking a literature class?
It's a general education class, so which I love teaching because I love having students from different backgrounds. I find that my industrial engineering majors and my computer science students are some of the most exciting students to work with because they actually change and help and hold my ideas up to a bit of scrutiny, which I really like. And so I like that kind of context.
Yeah, you can't bullshit engineers. I always love it. They're really truth tellers. You know, I taught briefly at Michigan after I got my MFA, and I always loved engineers. And there's creative writing workshops, you know, people writing poetry and short stories, and they've never written before. Engineers and music majors. I don't know why. Music majors, I always love them. I think because they're so diligent and they just know, like, okay, this is really hard. You know, I'm just going to have to do this. And the engineers, you're right. They would always check you, you know, it always checking, well, wait a minute, you know, and maybe call bullshit, but also not to call bullshit, but maybe force you to kind of think a little more deeply about it. They were also always the guy, men or women, usually guys who'd be like, you were talking about a poem, you teach a poem and say this and that, and this and that, looking at technique or a short story, and they'd be like, okay, I know you know exactly what question I gave. Do you really think the person who wrote this was thinking about all that? Because I don't know, right? And you know what? That's actually a great question. It's actually a really, really great question because someone's going to ask it, right? Someone's going to ask it. And the engineers are like, they don't care. They'll just throw themselves on the grenade.
They don't know Bart's Death of the Author.
Yeah, exactly, right? And like reader response theory, like, no, isn't that what it's called? And there is no text. The text varies with each reader. No, but it was like, I used to say, well, yeah, I think a lot of this, this poet was intentionally using these rhyme schemes or whatever, and, slant rhyme or whatever, and you're just teaching the poem to sort of teach them what slant rhyme is or whatever. But they used to say, like, but even if they didn't, it's pretty cool, right? I mean, like, you saw it. I've written stories and people go like, oh, I loved when you did this. And I was like, oh, shit, I didn't know I did it. But like, yeah, I kind of did. Because, some of creating and writing is subconscious or something. So I always thought, like, that's a great question. And does it matter? Does it matter if you're an engineer? Yeah, I mean, if you're reading that whether or not. So I always thought that was a great conversation to have, and was not always, but very often. Because first of all, it also tells you they're thinking deeply about the thing they're reading and what you're telling them. If they were just spaced out, like, yeah, whatever, well, this is going to be on the test. Like, those guys are awful. But these guys are like, wait a minute, really? You really think he meant that? And I don't know. That was a long tangent, but I think it's cool. So you're forcing them or asking them to think about the ethics of what they're doing with technology.
Right. I can give them the power to create that structure. I can give them the authority of doing something radically new. I've come up with this field that I'm calling ethical technology. The reason that I've come up with that field is because I track the job market in tech, and I've been doing it now for 5 or 6 years. So every time that LinkedIn or Indeed or any of them gets a new job with one of my keywords, it sends me an email. I put it in an Excel spreadsheet. And we've been doing some studies thinking about the development of the field and a rise in what I would qualify as ethical technology jobs, the chief ethics officer at Salesforce. And I wanted to understand what those jobs actually look like, what they actually do, whether or not we can have some, I think, agency in crafting those jobs so that they're not just kind of platitudinal jobs, but actually real effectual jobs, and what an ethical technologist as a person trained to do that job might need in terms of the skills. What kind of environment would produce that? Now, I'm at a polytechnic university. And so it is not taken for granted across the campus that ethics is something that, for example, an engineer ought to learn. But I think that increasingly folks at a university are interested in acknowledging at least the reality that the major questions of the 21st century, in the next couple decades at least, are not going to be primarily technological. Can we do this? But rather ethical. That's a question of should we do this? And particularly in the absence of regulation on the level of government, the ethical questions and getting the ethical questions right now falls as an onus on the companies. And there's a really kind of large slap on the wrist that you get. I would say it's more than that, but sometimes it can be a bit of a punishment if you get it wrong. So I think that there is on some level a good faith effort. Now, whether or not that good faith effort is going to be successful, whether or not ethics can be something that you can kind of prosthetically attach after you build a company, or whether it needs to be thought about in the construction of a company, is yet to be determined. But I think that the manifesto is a good attempt for the students to proactively define what an ethical technology environment looks like from their end, what kinds of things they need from an administration to care or to do these things, what kind of ethical concerns they have, what they want from their fellow students, what their vision of a space that would create a culture of ethical technology would look like. And this is a document that doesn't really exist yet. Now, it does exist because I did it last year. I do different assignments every quarter, and this is something that I did last year in 2020, so we're doing it again in 2021. But I think that articulating that vision and getting that vision from the students would be tremendously helpful for somebody like me, who is right now in the middle of an attempt to create an ethical technology vision.
Wow. Yeah, that's really amazing. Now that I'm learning what you do, I'm even more amazed. Do you think that until now, or up until this point, engineers or hackers would have just rushed headlong into, if we can do it, let's do it, and never stopped to even think about it, and then arrived at the problem of like, oh, wow, there are some negative connotations. So the idea is to get people thinking about this even before they create or as they create, think about the ethics of it.
sometimes CEOs will contact me and they'll ask me, well, how should I make my company ethical? And I say, I don't want to tell you what to do, but here's 8 questions that I ask when I'm thinking about whether or not a product is ethical. And I give them that 8-question list. And I think it's been really helpful, at least from their perspective, to think about that. The 8 questions are, just for your reference, and I'll send them to you too. 1, who will be using this product as widely as possible, preferably, and how? 2, how well does this product translate across different cultures, communities, and subgroups? 3, what cultural sensitivities might or must this product navigate? 4, what harm could this product potentially cause? I don't think we're in charge of figuring out all of the spectrum of harm that a product could cause, but there's some reasonable, I think, guesswork that we could do to figure that out, and I think we're responsible for doing that guesswork. 5, what historical wrongs does this product address or encounter? 6, what populations might be made vulnerable through the use and distribution and possible misuse of this product? 7, what good does this product enable? And I ask my students to not abstractly use the term good. I talk to people when I talk to CEOs about not abstractly using the word good, because if we abstractly use the word good, you can use good to define good as, I actually make people's lives in the disability community better, or you could use good as, well, I actually generate more venture capital. So you want to define good in a very specific way. And then the last one is the one that I'm adamant about. How does this product engage with and cohere to factual reality? So in other words, if you have a product and you think your product is doing this, but all the evidence shows that it's actually doing that, then your product does not do this. It does that.
But then you can abdicate all responsibility and say, yeah, the world is just, it's neither good nor bad. It's just, this is how it is. It's just evil. It's just raw. It's brutal, right? It's just, and then you go, well, then why should I feel like I got to be any better? Like there is no meaning to this. It's just, you might get hit by a truck or you might not.
You can see the attempt for poetic justice of some form or another, because that's easier. And I don't think that the premise that not everything works out for the best and some evil is just really evil necessarily logically deduces to, well, then we can just behave however. I think that that is an illogical next step. To say that not everything works out for the best does not mean that we ought not to strive for certain things to not become true. That isn't an abnegation of responsibility necessarily, but it is deeply unsettling. My thinking on this both comes out of writing quite a bit and thinking about how I write and what it means to create a vision that I share in language for somebody else to be able, with as little interference as possible, to be able to grasp what I'm trying to say to them. And it also comes out of, my research and my background is in human rights. And when I talk and when I think about human rights, the piece that I think has informed much of my thinking is a piece that I wrote on Adolf Eichmann. And I went into Hannah Arendt's archives and I looked at her research for the Eichmann in Jerusalem book that she wrote. And a lot of it was all on Eichmann's cliches and how by leveraging these cliches, he actually stopped himself from thinking. And when I think about the way that a cliche actually functions, I spend a lot of time thinking about this. What a cliche does is a cliche is a well-worn phrase that we use so that we don't have to have an original thought. So we can actually skip over the work of doing that. When you see a cliche, when you read, you actually skip over the thought because you don't have to process whether or not it's true, whether it's factual. You just say, yeah. So for example, I talk about how I think actually those kinds of well-worn wisdom that we pass on in the form of cliches can tend to do a lot of moral damage. I'll give you an example, one that I think has done more moral damage than probably any other piece of non-hate speech language. And that is the phrase, everything works out for the best. Can you imagine, Dan, saying to a woman who has just watched her house been bombed in Syria with her kids inside, don't worry, everything works out for the best. Or somebody just lost somebody in COVID. Everything works out for the best. Or a woman who has just had her child be thrown into a fire pit in Auschwitz. Everything works out for the best. Really? I think that that's a phrase that stops us from actually asking a metaphysically deeply unsettling question, which is, gosh, this world doesn't seem to be very just or very fair. And sometimes terrible things happen to good people, not because they've done anything wrong, but because this world is deeply unjust. And sometimes there is deep evil in this world, and we don't know where it comes from. And so we just say, everything works out for the best, to try and kind of retroactively skip over that unpleasant metaphysics.
Do you think it's difficult to define ethical when someone says, what can I do to make my company ethical? Are there different people have different definitions and that could both be legitimate?
Totally. So let me address that in two parts. The first is that ethics is a very broad tradition, and many of the great thinkers in ethics disagree with one another. So, for example, some people think that utilitarian ethics is the way to go. Some people think that consequentialist ethics is the way to go. And then some people say that ethics is a deeply kind of intentional dimension. Those are just three in the realm of a certain strand of continental thinking. So even the best thinkers have disagreements. But the second part of the answer is that just because there is no consensus exactly as to what ethics means does not mean that there are not better or worse answers to moral questions. So I'm not a moral relativist. I don't think that ethics is just somebody's opinion. I actually think that there are better or worse answers to moral questions. And I think that if we puzzle over it, we'll probably get more better answers than worse answers. And I think that it's actually our obligation to puzzle over it and to spend some time thinking about it. And I don't think that it's something that you can append at the end of building a company or product. I think it's something that has to be built in and intentional from the very beginning. Switching back to Gavin Bilson, because I want to press on him a little bit. The idea of Gavin Bilson starting an ethical technology movement, and by the way, spoiler alert, by the end of the show, he winds up a professor of ethical technology at Stanford University. It's funny, right? We're laughing. Until you realize the shades of that truth really happen. I'm starting to see actors who have participated in unethical technology, oftentimes making a fair amount of profit from it, then show up on ethics task forces or on boards or write ethics think pieces or fund ethical technology initiatives at universities. And just a statement of clarity, I'm not considering opening up the Facebook Center for Ethical Technology at Cal Poly. What's your take on this?
You see people like Gavin Belson sort of embracing ethics as a way to like whitewash their reputation, or
I see them being taken seriously on ethics boards.
Yeah. And I wonder why. I don't know. Maybe just because they're successful and they're rich and they're famous. Maybe everybody wants to have this big name person on their board. I mean, I don't think, Harvey Weinstein gets invited to a lot of those, or Jeffrey Epstein when he was alive. Oh, maybe he did. But I mean, they're probably, marginally sort of decent people, maybe. I don't know. Like, who would be an example of somebody that you've seen in that situation? I'm trying to think. Like,
I do see them showing up to now fund ethics projects or be interested in having a ethical something or other named after them. So is it as simple as they kind of want to whitewash?
Or do you wonder, I wonder if like they want to have a say in ethics, but they want it to be their ethics. Like if we were going to talk about ethics, then I better get my voice in here and, I'll absorb this and impose my will on it. So here's my definition of ethics. And I have a lot of money, so I can kind of push that on others. Maybe it's that. I don't know.
Yeah, I think one thing that Gavin Bilson potentially clarified for me is that ethical technology has become a kind of currency at this point. To say that you have a specialty in ethics and technology might be a new way of claiming a kind of place in the power system. So that's my super kind of cynical taste on it, which of course would implicate myself.
I got to get in on this though, because now that you think about it, it's great, right? I mean, is this like the gravy train? You just, get into ethics and technology? I don't know, man. I guess maybe it's a response to because big tech is getting so beaten up for being so bad. I mean, we haven't even talked about dodging taxes, which is another thing that drives me out of my mind, that they want to be, we're ethical and we're good citizens. But, oh, by the way, we do bend ourselves into pretzels, so we don't pay any taxes. Yeah, we wouldn't even want to pay for the stuff you give us. We don't even pay for the services we get. Like Apple, relies on the fire department and everybody else in Cupertino, but they also are like, well, if you don't give us a big tax break, we might move somewhere else. And it's like, wow, dude, like really? Or Amazon a few years ago when they went around making the poorest cities in the United States compete to get the Amazon second headquarters, and like Newark, New Jersey is like throwing themselves at Jeff Bezos' feet,
And of course, the press is Jeff Bezos brings jobs to New Jersey.
And I was like, well, you could bring jobs and be decent about it. In fact, you could do the opposite. You could look around at which cities really need help the most. And I go, I think I'm going to go there. I'm going to go to that one. That's one where I can really have some impact. Yeah, it's just, I'll tell you, I thought of this earlier when you're talking about diversity and women and childcare. A true story, someone I know who worked at Apple, when they made the spaceship campus? And Tim Cook was showing this person wow, look at this. Look at the spaceship. And it's got this and that. And look at this gym. Look at this gym. This gym is amazing. It's got this and that. And the other person's a woman. She's like, yeah, dude, where's the childcare? And he's like, we don't have to. She's like, because I don't care about the gym. What would matter to me is if I could have childcare. And his response was, yeah, but we have a gym. Yeah, but look at this gym. Like this goes to 11.
Well, it's a really interesting way of keeping women with children out of the workforce and making sure that you keep younger people who are childless and maybe can work longer hours in that workforce. And it is a systemic way, it seems to me, of giving platitudes about kind of employment benefits while withholding the things that actually people who are underrepresented in that community seem to actually need.
I mean, I'm sure you've heard stories of like the woman who gets pregnant and then suddenly is underperforming and gets fired, right? I mean, it's not very well hidden. They don't really do much of a good job of like, covering it up.
One last question. You're a writer and talked a lot about ethical technology manifestos. What would you put in an ethical technology manifesto if you were writing satire?
That's an evil question because I'm not good at thinking on my feet. I'm the kind of person like 4 hours from now, I'm going to come up with it and be like, oh, that was it. So what would I say if I was writing satire and I was writing an ethical manifesto? If I was, I'm doing satire about someone who thinks they're very ethical, but they're really not, right? I don't know. Yeah, first of all, yeah, you do cliches, like you said, and like they did in Silicon Valley, right? You'd have empty, meaningless platitudes. I think you'd have ways that almost make you the victim or make you the hero, like you would take child labor in China and turn it into like growth, job creation, things like that. I don't know. 4 hours from now, I will email you a zinger. I promise you.
We'll put that in the manifesto. Talk to me 4 hours from now. Dan, thank you very much for the conversation.